Welcome to the continuing revolution. And yeah, those that aren't here are probably among the people that were up at 3:01 last night staring at the moon. It was a nice conversation.
Howling at the moon. Yeah.
Howling at the moon would be one way of looking at it. I guess, I love that line the science fiction writer, or whoever it was that wrote, actually it wasn't a science fiction writer, if God...
It might have been me.
It might have been you. You notice I just used the word God right before you said that. Right. But if God had intended us to go into space, he or she would have given us a moon. Kraft Eric, thank you, Dave Brody. And somebody else. Yeah. I should be giving away free prizes. Oh, speaking of not free stuff, I have a book that's available downstairs called Return to the Moon. And as you saw last night, our prize went to a movie about the moon, which is available at your local video store. An amazing, actually great movie. We were sitting around last night doing the typical space geek thing, trying to tear it apart on its technical merits. And actually, they didn't do too bad. They didn't do too bad. And Jack Schmidt should be...
And he took it well.
Yes, yeah. And Jack Schmidt should be very excited because it's all about helium-3.
Yeah.
So, anyway. It's an amazing thing that we do have a moon. And if you think about it, if there hadn't been a time in our history when you were able to look up and see that there was a body nearby that had mountains that looked somewhat like a planet, and just imagine if there had been no past with no moon at all. It might have been a very different and interesting history, and taken quite a bit longer to realize that we were actually on a planet ourselves and that there were others out there. And I think that's a very interesting thing. As you know, there's been a little bit of a shakeup on the whole lunar thing lately. Exciting times, or interesting times, as the Chinese say, who may be there before us. I was involved in helping put together a thing called the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group. I'm a big moon fan, although if I do write a book, it's going to be called All of the Above, because I support all the destinations. The interesting thing about the moon, to me, is that it's a great training ground for every other thing we want to do. It is, as I said in the opening talk, the edge marker to me of the near frontier and the far frontier. There are people who are working on business plans that don't have too high of a giggle factor involving the moon, whether that's actually sending small robots there, as in the Google Lunar X Prize. That's who it is, Bob Richards. Let me see Bob.
Yeah, and Dennis.
Those ISU guys, they stay up so late. But there are also other plans about flying people around the far side. A la, what was it, Apollo 8, I think it was. One of our guests last night is actually one of the people working on those plans. Art Dula, pulled me aside and started waxing poetic about some plans that I hadn't really realized Excalibur Almaz is looking at. So anyway, the moon is very interesting, and we'll get on to the speakers here in just a moment. I do want to say it was a little unfortunate, the president's language in his speech in Florida. Sometimes it's better not to slap somebody that you don't want to, have be a negative constituency, shall we say. The lunar scientists have been waiting a long, long time, and I know they were very excited when President Bush said we were going back on the way to Mars. And again, I worked with several. I have to say, this is just for fun because I can say it now. I was secretly flown. Secretly, I was pledged to secrecy, along with several other people at the time, to Maryland to have meetings to help set up this thing that became the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, and it was kind of funny. And it was a great group, and it's a good group. And what we have now is a situation where, after all this work, preparing payloads, things like ISRU, looking at all kinds of great ways of doing things, bombing the moon, which I just love that one. The internet just went nuts with that. Bombing the moon that we had never really been to. A lot of great planning, and then to have a president say, well, been there, done that, we're not going. That is a problem. It is a challenge, but I also think it might be an opportunity if it's played right. And that opportunity might lie in the idea of leveraging off of this oncoming commercial activity. And maybe going in and, as I used to say in New York with some of my Jewish friends, no offense intended, but playing the guilt game and going in and saying, okay, you've cut us off for official missions, for flying us there, but why not give us some bucks so we can buy some rides? Now that way you've hit two things. You've helped spawn commercial activities and you've continued our lunar enterprise. For me, the government's interest in the moon, obviously, it remains strategic on the one hand. I would hate to see the Chinese land there and just claim as a research base the entire South or North Pole. Although I would love to see them show up and join us for tea. And I also believe as a training ground, the ability to live off planet. But I'll let our speakers get into that. We have two speakers available. And what?
We just sobered up quicker than everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't go.
There you go. I was actually laying there at 8:38 this morning saying, wow, I feel really good, waiting for the call. Bob's on his way. Okay, good. Waiting for the call from my hotel. Anyway, Bruce has been around a long time in the field. He's one of the heroes of the cause, one of the people that works in and out of the palace. He's able to walk through the guard posts on the drawbridge unmolested either way. He helped create, he's worked in and out here at Ames for many, many years. Is partially responsible in a way for us having this conference up here, I have to say, and has helped with a lot of the cooperation. He worked on such things as Pioneer Venus. He was involved with space shuttle processing, the Lunar Mars program in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's about time, buddy. And worked with Space Hab and Kistler and groups like that. And the Space Portal, which if you want to mention at any point, feel free to do so. So a longtime traveler, longtime member and supporter and advocate of the Space Frontier Foundation. Next, a representative of the Stars and Bars.
Confederate Space Command.
I'm sorry. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Dennis Wingo, longtime friend, and regular visitor to my couch, so to speak. Chief Technical Officer of Orbital Recovery Corporation, which was working with us back in the MirCorp days. We were going to do some satellite servicing. He's the founder of SkyCorp. And most importantly for this panel, wrote and published the book Moonrush, which I heavily recommend, of course, immediately after you buy Return to the Moon.
Which I wrote a chapter in.
And he wrote a chapter in this, by the way. Really good stuff. Then we have Wendell Mendel. Wendell is, what can I say, one of my Obi-Wans, really, yes, truly. All of our Obi-Wans.
Jedi Master.
Yes, a Jedi Master. One of the touchstones that all of us, Bob, who's going to show up in a
Better
while.
than a Sith Lord.
Yeah. Yet at times, some of the conversations, well, anyway.
That's your ex-boss at JSC.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Always repudiating the dark side and educating us as to what it can do to us. But Wendell has been around a long time, a long promoter and leader of what was the Lunar Underground for many, many years. Became the Lunar Overground and may go back to being underground again. Yeah, buried again. Oh, that regolith.
we lived in the tunnels before.
The ejecta. Regolith happens. I like that. And so Wendell has again been a stalwart for a long time of this cause, and I'll let his wisdom speak for itself through his words. What was your title now, Wendell?
Currently, I'm in Constellation.
I love it.
The Office of Lunar and Planetary Exploration.
There you go. Yeah. Just an amazing mind. So we have three great minds up here. Bob Richards of the Google X Prize and Odyssey Moon will be joining us soon. So I'll introduce him now, and then he can slip in subtly, just pretend he's been here the whole time, and we'll go with it. So anyway, I'm going to have each one of you say just a couple of minutes of what your thoughts are, and try and keep it short, and then we can get to some dialogue. Okay, short as in Russian short. How's that?
great.
Okay, good. Something under 3 hours, and then we'll get into some sort of a dialogue and discussion on the topic. So we'll start with Bruce.
Yeah.
With the microphone, or you can, yeah, come on over here. Go ahead.
Whatever. I'm easy. So good morning, everybody. You have my admiration for braving the Sunday morning. I mean, of all things, and Rick, to see you at this ungodly hour, it is truly amazing, buddy. Yeah, you are an inspiration to us all. We've been talking a lot. I don't know about you guys, but the nostalgia here. So I was thinking back, and God, I've done this before. Where was that? And so I went back into my archives, and I pulled this out. Excuse me. As I kill it. 31 years ago, the first conference I ever put on was Remember the Future of the Apollo Legacy. This was the 10th anniversary of the first lunar landing. We did it up in San Francisco, and this was a joint venture between the AIAA and the AAS. This was before the Space Frontier Foundation and all that. So, and we had a bunch of the Apollo astronauts there, and I got to meet them, and I was so excited, And we were just sure that we were going back and we were going to do stuff and it was going to be great. Well, it didn't quite work out the way that we had hoped. But things are looking up. So, I mean, that's one of the things you learn in this business is you got to be a little bit patient, that things don't always happen the way that you wish they would, or you thought they would, or you hoped they would, but I got to say things are looking up. So what's going on lately? So, fast forward 31 years, and here we are back again. We're talking about going back to the moon. John, kind of told you the kind of the plan right now, and of course, NASA doesn't write the checks, Congress writes the checks, so it's kind of up to them to decide, which path we go here. But the exciting part of this is, and with all due respect, it's not all up to NASA anymore, and I think that's a healthy thing. So if you go talk to guys like Bob Bigelow wants to go to the moon, and he's got some plans to go do it. You talk to Elon Musk. Elon Musk not only wants to go to the moon, he wants to go to Mars. I think so does Bob. So these guys have plans of their own, and not only that, but they're executing on those plans, and they're making stuff happen. And so I think the exciting part here is how the government and the private sector can work together to do things that neither one of them could do alone. And a great example of that is COTS. The Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, and the follow-on CRS contract. So I think hopefully that's a model for the way some of these things can work. So hopefully somewhere in the bowels of the beast there, that there's some people thinking about, how could these kinds of leveraging, take place. Let's talk specifically about the moon. Last week we had the NASA Lunar Science Institute meeting at Ames. It was very well attended. We had like 500 people show up. Brad and a bunch of other people. Wendell was there, and a good time was had by all. Now, mostly this is science geeks getting there to talk about stuff that I just flat do not understand. But we have set up a thing that I have just taken over the leadership of called the Commercial Lunar Focus Group. As part of NLSI. We just had our second meeting and everything like that. And we are going to continue this going forward, and we're going to be meeting at the League meeting in September in Washington. So that's one of the things that we've got going on that I think is exciting. And so we got a bunch of people. We had 4 of the Google Lunar X Prize teams that were represented at the meeting there, and a bunch of other people that are just interested in commercial lunar stuff. So the thing that I wanted to kind of leave you with, besides helium-3, is 600 million tons of water ice on the North Pole of the moon. Not a few tons, not 100 tons, not 1,000 tons, but 600 million tons of water. The keystone of life. What can you guys do with that? And who's going to be the first trillionaire that figures out how to make money off of that? So I think those are some of the opportunities that are out there. You know, the commercial sector is interested, the government's interested, the international community is interested, and the general public is interested. I think the one thing that's really disappointing to me, and we talked about this a little bit, is every single friend of mine that you know, knows me but is not involved in the space program, when they heard the president's thing, they said 2 things. It said, I'm sorry that we're not going back to the moon, and I'm sorry your budget got cut. Well, I had to say, no, neither one of those things is true. We're not going back to the moon the way that we said we were going to go back to the moon. Hopefully we're going to go back in a better way, and hopefully we're going to go back sooner. And our budget didn't get cut, the budget got increased. So there's some of the perceptions. So part of the task, I think, for all of us here is to go out and get that word out that the space program is changing, but that's a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing, and that now we're opening this up to opportunities for everybody to participate, so that this can be an inclusive game instead of an exclusive game, and it can be participatory instead of, you know, you're sitting there watching it in a dark movie studio, but you actually get to play in the game. So anyway, that's what I had to do. I really had wanted Rob Kelso to be here, and unfortunately he was unavailable. So he sends his apologies and all that. But we are working on this stuff. We have done some stuff with an orphan instrument list that we put together of instruments that NASA had sitting around, or the scientists had sitting around, that would be potential for flying to the moon. So we put this list together for John. And so we're going to be releasing that. We're going to be working with the League. They're going to put it up on their website so that we'll be able to go through and add to this, and that there is some discussions within NASA about how to take advantage of this, about how to leverage off of this commercial activity, and hopefully something will pop out here reasonably soon on that. So, but there are at least some discussions going on and some things like that within Washington. You never know, but we're hopeful that some good things will happen. So our best days are ahead of us, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Hello? Is it working? Microphone, share microphone.
Why don't you go to the podium?
All right. Oh, it's working. It's working now. Good. I'd rather sit down. The moon. And again, I'm going to have a hat tip nod here to my friend Wendell, who has been, one of the first documents I ever read was a conference that Wendell helped put on in the early 1980s, the lunar bases in the 21st century.
Lunar bases and space activities of the 21st century.
Yeah, and it was an absolutely amazing document, and I have, and John here has funded some of our effort in looking backward to the Apollo era and getting the marvelous data that we had there. And I have a historical cast of mind, so I go to the old fossils here. And Wendell has always been an inspiration, and the documents and the things and the ideas that as far back as the 1950s of how space would unfold before this NASA thing ever existed. People like von Estel, von Braun, Disney, and how this was going to play out. And I recently saw a movie that my wife loves. It's When Worlds Collide. And in that movie, they figure out that this planet's going to come and hit Earth and all, and these scientists make these presentations to the government that if we don't do this, then we're all going to die. The government blows them off. Well, this rich guy comes in and says, you know, I'm really scared and I don't want to die, so I'll fund your spaceship. Private enterprise in the movie. It was always assumed in the 1950s that private enterprise would be right there or ahead of the government in space activities. And my own research in looking at the moon, when I wrote my book, Moon Rush, I said in the book, we go to Mars to help take our civilization there. We go to the moon to help save our civilization here. And that's something Bob Werb talks about, Rick has always talked about, all of us in the Space Frontier Foundation. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the full exploitation, the full industrialization, that's not NASA's role. NASA, and what I have read for years and years and years and seen, it's like NASA really in some ways looking at it, and I came into the space arena from the computer world, and so we wanted to bring Silicon Valley to NASA, and Elon has done a marvelous job of doing that, and NASA is learning from that, so there's a synergy there. But some of the things that NASA has done, like the Apollo program, where it's quite interesting that when the Apollo samples came back and they analyzed the samples, they looked at it, and I've read all the books, I've read the Acta Astronauticas, and they said, well, there's all this water here, but the moon is bone dry, so this water has to be contamination. And it took NASA again, and it took NASA and other space agencies, it's taken us 40 years from the Apollo program to where we've had Chandrayaan, we've had Cayuga, we've had now Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in orbit, and even data from planetary programs like Cassini. And this was what my takeaway from the NLSI conference. And I've been going to these conferences since the 1980s. Everything that we speculated about in the 1980s in the Space Exploration Initiative, everything that we wanted to try to find out when we planned missions back then. And I was a PI, John, on a mission called Lunar Resource Mapper. And Congress took the money away after the contract was gone because they didn't want to go to the moon back then. And that was our Congress. So, you know, any of this stuff about NASA changing direction, guess what? Get used to it. That's the way our Congress is, and that's the way our nation works. But everything that we speculated and hoped for in the 1980s and early 1990s is now no longer in doubt. Like what Bruce just said, we've 600 million tons of water at the lunar poles. But at the end of the day, is NASA going to exploit that 600 million tons? No, it's not NASA's job. NASA's job as a government agency in its best form, and I look at the government and other things that it did, like the national railroads, the Panama Canal, the interstate highway system. All of these are commerce enablers. And NASA in its charter is to help enable commerce. It's not to do commerce. I mean, if you want NASA to do commerce, then, you know, it's the Soviet Union. But NASA at its best is a technology enabler in things like, and I've just had this discussion with John, Hall thrusters, technologies, the attitude control thrusters on the Apollo lunar modules is now the standard apogee motor for geosynchronous communication satellites. All of these technologies that NASA has developed, all of these studies and all of these conferences and all of these ideas that they put out there are enablers for us. And we're not going to get to the moon as private enterprise in one swell food. It's just not going to happen. We could get Bill Gates and what's his name from Kansas, that they want all these billionaires to give all this money to save the world. If both of them showed up and said, we want it to go to space, and that's the way we're going to save the world, it's possible. But we're not going to get there in one fell swoop. And what we're looking at now is how to get there. And then as an engineer and as a scientist, I look at the moon, geosynchronous orbit. is 2/3 of the way to the moon, even though it's only 20,000 miles in space. In energy terms, it's more than halfway there. And Joe, my good friend Joe, will go on at length about that, and we all will who are technologists. But there's a place to make money in geo orbit before we get to the moon. And then we can extend that to the moon. We can extend that to L1. We can extend that to the moon. I think that's how private enterprise is going to go. But we have this marvelous thing we call the space station. NASA is an enabler for us to start. And that's where I think we're going to go. And I think that's how we're going to be able to do it, because NASA's not going to do it alone. It's just not NASA's role. And then I want to turn it over to my good friend Wendell to say how NASA has helped us get there.
So, Wendell, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. This is the way I usually see Rick, except he doesn't have his cap on. I have to look at that bald head. He's asking for, no, Rick doesn't ask me for checks. He knows better. I want to say a few things about stuff that's gone on before. Dr. Olson had in his myriad of charts a very small picture up there of the Lunar 1, which had been discovered by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And as soon as it was discovered, the astronomers at Apache Point in New Mexico immediately tried to range with their laser to the retroreflector set on Lunar 1, because it's a very, very important location on the moon to get good scientific data, and they never knew where it was. They've searched for it, never been able to find it. Now they know where it was. They went and ranged. And by golly, the performance of the retroreflector was 1 to 1.5 orders of magnitude better than any of the other retroreflectors in the Apollo arrays or the other Lunokhod. And they're just mystified as to why the reflection should be so good. And I have a very simple explanation. In 1993, Richard Garriott bought the Lunokhod 1 from the Russians, even though nobody knew where it was. And now that it's under private management, its performance has increased enormously. So.
He has a maintenance staff.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right. That's right. The second thing I would like to mention is that the arrival of the high net worth individual in the late 90s reminded me of Asimov's Foundation series, where the great sociologist had predicted the evolution of society in the galaxy, and there was a foundation set up to follow his work and be able to predict how the galaxy's political systems were going to evolve. And every 10 years they had a hologram of him that would reappear and say exactly what was happening. But suddenly there was a mutant that had appeared called the Mule, I think, in that, and was disrupting the whole predictive apparatus, and it was diverging from the holograms that would appear every 10 years. And so we find out that there was a second foundation that had been secretly established in order to actually do original research in case something odd happened, the wild card. Well, the HNWI are the wild card that I had not expected, but that I had anticipated might happen, but I didn't know in what form it would take. Because I've made several runs at, quote, closing the business case, which is ironic since I'm a lifetime civil servant and shouldn't know anything about that at all. But historically, it's interesting to follow the reasoning historically. When we started the Lunar Underground in 1982, the NASA plan in 1982 was that the human spaceflight program was going to consist of a space transportation system, a shuttle to a station, and then from the station, vehicles that you now call, I noticed in this meeting, space-to-space vehicles. We called them orbital transfer vehicles in those days. But it was going to be essentially a FedEx in space, which might be called SpaceX, I guess, in which case you deliver your payload to the Cape, it would then be taken to anywhere in space through this delivery system. And astronauts were essentially going to be FedEx drivers. I mean, that was the NASA plan, and in 1999 it would be in place. And what we brought to the table in 1982 was the little note that in order to go from the 28-degree space station to geostationary orbit, you have to do a plane change. And that is very expensive in delta V. And if you had a rocket, a space-to-space rocket that could do that, delta V, it could go to the moon just automatically, because the moon was actually about the same delta V as the plane change to geostationary orbit. So we said, well, you know, do you really believe that in 1999 the human space program is going to stop and not do anything else? Do you realize that you will be on the threshold of being able to put human beings on the moon just by blindly following this path? And so what we tried to do is to get NASA to write into its future planning documents that these orbital transfer vehicles would be able to carry much larger mass than they planned to, because NASA was anticipating only very wimpy small satellites at geostationary orbits, and that's how big the rockets would be to carry that kind of mass. But if you made them bigger and planned to carry humans, this system would be ready to take you to the moon. Well, so all of the graphs that you see in the 84 studies and 85 studies were based on that kind of a transportation architecture going through the station. And what Hugh Davis noticed in 83 was that this little stuff going back and forth to the moon was not carrying humans, and it was not carrying cargo, it was carrying liquid oxygen. That was almost all the mass. 80%. And so he realized that if you had a fuel station on the moon, going back to some 60s technology that made liquid oxygen, you could cut your mass into LEO in half, and that was the surrogate for cost. We didn't know how much anything cost, but if you grade everything in terms of mass to LEO, that's a surrogate for cost, because the transportation system just drove everything. So that was our cost number. It wasn't dollars, it was mass to LEO. And if you could cut it in half with a filling station on the moon, wow. And then Hugh Davis took his little Apple computer and did a scenario building, and he claimed that if you could deliver that oxygen down to low Earth orbit, that you could get a 3-to-1 mass payback ratio, which would be like a profit. And it turned out that when somebody actually redid it a couple of years later, they found that Hugh had snuck in some fairly optimistic technology assumptions about air brake performance and ISP on cryogenic engines. They weren't crazy assumptions, but they were optimistic. So maybe the passback rate wasn't really 3-to-1. But that was what passed for economics in those days. And it took me only a year or so to realize that if we were going to have some kind of permanent thing on the moon, you know, we'd have to, quote, live off the land. Well, that's old hat. But in those days, you know, people didn't think about living off the land, because NASA's a rocket agency. It's not a living off the land agency. And so you had to kind of really emphasize that. And if you're living off the land, you're talking about resources. And I found out by doing some research that I am one of the co-inventors of the term ISRU. It was first used in a workshop in 1986 that Kyle Fairchild and I put together at Epcot Center. And the reason we wanted to put together that workshop was because I wanted to bring CEOs from private companies together to discuss what was required for the private sector to get interested in investment. And I was working with George Kosmetsky at the time, who was holding my hand, because I didn't know anything about that. And we wanted to hold that workshop to talk to the private sector, and NASA headquarters wouldn't fund it. They would only fund a workshop that would list technologies. And so we did that, but we had a working group of CEOs from private companies. And what came out of that was the fact that investors can't wait forever for return on their money. There is an expectation of 3 to 5 years you're going to see some real movement. And so if you had a problem that we had in those days, or that we still have, that the return is 20 years down the line in your technology investment, your business plan has to have plateaus, so that while you have an endpoint, you are developing products that are marketable on Earth or in other places every 5 years, so the investors get bootstrapped over the 20-year. And that was, you know, that was right turns out nobody pays any attention to it. But that was based, oh yeah, except you. But that was assuming an investor who had a desire to make a lot of money. Now, we could never put it all together, but suddenly in the 90s we have Musk, Bezos, Bigelow, Allen, Carmack. I mean, all of these people suddenly appeared all at once, and they were building things without the kind of classic business plan. They were taking their own resources that they had accrued through some other means and were investing them in this crazy space thing, which everybody knows doesn't make money. Why were they doing that? Well, it's clear. Apollo. They are from the Apollo generation. They are the idealists. And this is the legacy that Bruce talks about of Apollo. The politicians are completely clueless about. That there was a generation that was touched. And when that generation actually got rich guys, and I mean really rich guys, what happened? They started putting their money into the dream at that time, but now 20 years, 30 years later. And it's really amazing to watch because now suddenly the momentum has shifted in a way to where the government is not the only conceivable agent for doing this. We always worked under the assumption that NASA was the only conceivable agent for carrying this out. And now that's no longer the case. So suddenly we have a chance to put together stories where you can make money so that Dennis can go and sell services in space, and Joe Carroll can go mine orbital debris, and Jack Schmidt can go mine helium-3 if he's alive long enough. And we can do these kinds of things not because the NASA program happened to allow it, but because we've got people really with initiative and different kinds of paradigms of operations that might provide us the means. And that's amazingly exciting. I always felt that we needed to have an in-space economy to make this, and John Marburger talked about that at in the 2005 Goddard Memorial Symposium. He came back to make a correction. This vision for space exploration, remember, it's for creating economic wealth. NASA didn't register, but that's really what we're trying to do, is to create economic wealth in space. And my question to myself was, how will I know when there's a space economy? And I came to the conclusion that I will know when I see the first company that operates in space and sells a product or service to another company that operates in space without the Earth being an intermediary of some kind. Then I know I have the first seed of a space economy. And how do you trigger it? Well, before the high net worth individual showed up, I tried to look at analogies. Space is an underdeveloped country. How do we develop underdeveloped countries? Well, usually we go in and exploit them because they have some really rich resource. But there are countries that don't have many resources. And I try to look historically at how that is developed. It's not easy, but it always starts with a transportation infrastructure. And once you have that, then you can start to move around. But it has to be a flexible and purposed transportation infrastructure. And for all the wonderful work that went into the ESAS architecture and constellation, and by the way, I worked with them, and they are good people, and they're smart people, and they work their butts off. So anybody says constellations, but the crap is out to lunch. They worked hard, but they were given a story, and I think the story was not the one I would have chosen, and I think we now know that maybe it wasn't really the right story, and we're moving into the right story. And that's the tragedy of all the hyperbole and misinformation and polemic that we see going on around here, that we hope can get corrected as we try to say there is a story that makes sense for creating economic wealth and a broad future, and I hope now we're on that path. Great.
Thank you, Wendell. I have to.
Can I tell one quick?
Right, just real,
story?
yeah, we'll come back to you here. Just real quick. One correction I want to add to your pantheon, and when we have to do it because we're at the foundation, and one of our heroes, Walt Anderson, who was one of the first rich guys out there who actually put the bucks in.
He was
And
a loner in a lot of ways.
yeah, and got it, yeah, in a lot of ways, but he got out there early. And well, Bruce, go ahead and make your comment, and then I'm going to ask the audience, ask y'all a question.
So I wanted to just say, you know, one of the hero worship things that Wendell did that really got my attention was we were all at this workshop that's been mentioned in 2006 when Shanna Dale invited a whole bunch of us to come back and talk, and Rick was there. And so at the final day, there was 7 different groups, and it was mentioned that settlement was the consensus that everybody came to. Well, but you know, Wendell had the brilliant quote, and unfortunately Shanna had already left by the time he said it, but he said, if settlement is your long-term goal, he said, you have the wrong architecture. And I thought that was just brilliant.
I like your analogy about building roads. I was thinking about how they're building highways in Afghanistan. Then my analogy brain started to slip into, and how do we get them off the opium culture and the Taliban? But we'll stop there. My question, I guess, is, you know, we've got the Google Lunar X Prize, and we all know that prizes are fine as a great way of getting attention, but the follow-ons, what count if you're going to go into a business model? What's your business model post winning the prize? And we're at this stage now, and again, you know, we're trying to make turn this into, you know, lemons into lemonade, shall we say? What in that pushing towards that business model? Not the Wall Street, maybe a little more Japanese business model as far as getting return on investment, a little longer. But what do you guys see as something that could, given the current world we're in, be something that people, maybe in the audience, some of the younger folks, we have a lot of young people here, might start playing with as ideas that could start producing returns involving the moon within a reasonable sense of time?
I'm going to take the first stab at that. Again, history. I just read the final report from the Surveyor program. And this was 7 spacecraft or landers that we put on the moon in the 1960s. And in this, because my thing is platinum group metals and metals on the moon, and just very briefly, the thesis is that 3 out of every 100 craters on the moon is from a metallic object that has hit the moon. And if you look at the curves and all, there's a very high probability, in theory, that some of these metals could be in the millions to billions of tons remains in the vicinity of the crater. And I read about the landing radar on Surveyor. And as Surveyor was coming in at 15 kilometers, they turned the landing radar on, and they noticed that in certain areas there were certain anomalous craters that had much higher reflectivity than the rest of them. So an idea that goes along with the Google X Prize is that the Google X Prize also, 99% chance you're going to have a landing radar. You just turn that landing radar up a little bit and make it a little higher quality. Then what you could do is, while you're on the way down for the Google X Prize, as part of it, not even as a follow-on, but you could do this as a follow-on as well, have a high-powered radar. And then when you come down, you can see what these are, and then maybe as a follow-on lander, you land in one of these areas. And just think how the game has changed. If a Google X Prize or some other rover rolls up to a rock that's 50 meters tall that's made out of metal, you start getting Anglo-American mining interested at that time. Because again, we've just had this game change at NLSI that finally the entire community can no longer doubt. All of the doubters that told Paul Spudis that he was wrong, all these doubters that said Stu Nazet, all these different people were wrong when they were talking about all the water, they're now shut up. We need somebody
No,
to
they're
do
not.
that as well.
I am still not shut up. And I was going to tell you that if you're going to tell your investor there's 600 million tons of water at the poles, I would urge you to get more opinions. We don't know that yet, and I am on the side that says that that's a bunch of bull. And I could go into it in more detail. I won't bother you here because we'll just cause a lot of controversy. But all I can say is that there are people that are called exploration geophysicists who on the Earth are employed by oil companies to use certain kinds of techniques to find certain kinds of resources, and they look for geological formations in which they know for sure that this kind of resource is highly probable to occurrence in that kind of a geological formation. We don't have those kinds of geological formations on the moon, although I will say that the newest discoveries about the moon give us new insights into processes of which we were unaware 10 years ago. And I can't be as negative as I would have been 10 years ago about some of these things, because we're learning that there are things we don't really know about the moon. But I can tell you that the evidence is not in for 600 million tons of water in the polar craters. And there's a very peculiar and a rather unfortunate thing going on with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter right now, where the, quote, advanced neutron detector is giving results that contradict the lunar prospector results of concentrations in the polar craters. It turns out there's some very serious questions about the technical performance of the instrument, and there was some underlying animosity and conflict at the NLSI conference earlier this week, and the jury's not in on that yet, but it is very strange that the results from the LEND are not showing up in the same way as the results of the lunar prospector, and we're going to have to sort that out. But I just want to tell you that it's not a slam dunk yet about the resources of water on the moon.
But one thing we do know is that 40% of the moon is oxygen. So if I was going to answer that question, and yeah, or more. So if, you know, one of the things that we looked at, and we did a study for John of looking, okay, what if you could get at this oxygen, and we didn't even assume there was water. We were just assuming that it's locked up in the regolith, and we know that. And we've done a lot of work over the last, and Wendell's been involved in this, and Jerry Sanders and the guys at JSC have done a lot of work on this stuff about how do you crack that out. So there's like 27 different ways to do this. And if you've got 3 or 4 hours you don't know what to do with, just go ask Ed McCullough, and he'll explain every single one of them to you. You know, in
Ed's
detail.
done every one of them, oddly
Yeah.
enough. I mean, it's really strange.
And so what we did is we went and looked at that and said, okay, if you could do this, would this make economic sense? And so we went through this exercise and showed that there was some really big offsets that you could get in, you know, upwards of like $1 billion a year offset for a constellation type architecture. Not that you would sell it for that, but you would be able to have cost savings of that. So this is a significant amount of money. Even in Washington, $1 billion starts to get people's attention. And when I went back and started looking at the literature on this, I found out, you know, what these guys have been saying, and that a lot of the early studies on this were looked at not using the oxygen on the moon, but bringing it back into LEO and for the fuel depot. So if you go talk with Dallas and those guys about that, you know, now it starts getting pretty interesting. If there's something that you can do on the harvest on the moon, not to bring back to Earth, but bring back to Earth orbit, and then sell that at a profit. Now you start getting, again, what Wendell said you need for this space economy is something that you can do in space and use in space that will make you money. And I think if I had to pick the thing that I thought was the low-hanging fruit, that's probably the one I'd pick.
Yeah, Bruce is absolutely right about all of that. And there are paths to create a resource wealth. And in fact, one of the things we looked at in the early days when we first began to realize this in 85, 86, was what conceivable market could use the material. And I was trying to make a list of them. At the time, there was something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and that was going to have all kinds of mass in Earth orbit, and mass from the moon might make a difference in how you built that. The second was solar power satellites, which is the old familiar that if you really go that way, and we know the old studies, the Ed Bach and so on, that shows that resources on the moon can do that. And then there's the fuel issue. Now we're talking seriously about fuel depots in orbit, and we need to look carefully at what the flows might be in cislunar space that would enable that, because we're talking about gravity wells is what we're talking about. We're talking about launch facilities and so on. And so there are stories that you can put together that might begin to make sense in our current environment that would not have made sense in other architectures. But we might be able to put together the kind of architecture where these things can make sense and can create economic wealth and can involve the moon in that story. So I don't want to say that there's no answer. I just want to say that some of the bigger font headlines, you really need to do some cross-checking.
So there might actually be a message that could go back. It's interesting. In this case, it goes from NASA back to NASA, but the message being that what NASA's approach, given that the moon isn't now a central target of the current program, but as far as in the interest of developing what we call that coastal infrastructure capability, that what NASA might want to start looking at is those kinds of activities that where the NASA dollars, whatever few dollars are going to be spent in this area, are leveraged to a maximum amount to find or mine these kinds of quasi-commercial, or, you're always in that catch-22. We're dealing with COTS and CDEV, the same kind of thing. It's a catch-22 where the commercial companies, you're a breakout from a catch-22. You're trying to get a commercial takeoff point for certain activities. Now, the commercial transportation companies are going to be fine on their own, as I said before. But when it comes to the moon, we're reaching beyond the edge of that, hitting that giggle point for business plans. So the government role then becomes to spend its dollars in the most wise way possible to break beyond that catch-22 point. So what can the government spend its money on? Replenishing fuel depots, things like that.
The key, Rick, is that the systems analysis is not just about rockets.
Right.
The systems analysis is about the whole Earth-Moon complex and how you move through it, how you operate in it, and how you leverage the potential resources that are in it. Because you can very easily design systems that totally ignore the potential. You can design systems that are designed to exploit the potential. And one needs to have a dialogue about what the path is that brings all these things together that make it affordable and have commercial opportunity and create the economy that we discussed. That's the key, is to create the economy. And sometimes it's not the thing that looks like the most efficient system in terms of delta V.
Right.
And there's two gotchas that I worry about. One is the low Earth orbit orbital debris. Don Kessler and I were young squirts together, and I was a good friend of his, and we've written papers together. And I had a tagline in a paper in 1987 that said maybe low Earth orbit's going to be untenable. And I wrote a paper in 93 about a station at the Earth Moon Lagrange point L1, I wrote it because I was concerned that our space outpost may not be low Earth orbit in the future. It may be someplace else. And there are lots of advantages there, but then the radiation starts to get you. And that's the other gotcha, is the radiation in humans and how we learn how to deal with that. Jim Logan's talk, his talk was about going to Mars, but he has an incredible rant that he will give you about the real problem with the radiation humans, because I hear it a lot here at Johnson. His office is not far from mine. But it's really true, and we need to think carefully about how we deal with that in all of our plans about settlements and so on. Isaac Asimov said that he thought, I heard him give a talk 25 years ago where he said, the people who will explore the solar system will not be people from Earth. They will be people from the moon. Mm-hmm. We said, why is that, Isaac? He said, because they will be used to living underground inside their spaceship and not so worry so much about being on top and then on the outside. And I said,
But to go to your question a little bit more, how NASA can help to be an enabler, and I want this to kind of be a theme, is if you took a look at constellation, there was a decision made, and Wendell and I have talked about this, to not do ISRU because the technical readiness level was simply insufficient for NASA to bet the farm on it. One of the things that NASA could help do as a technology development agency is to help bring that TRL level, that technical readiness level, to a higher level. Support different ISRU development technologies. There's 27 methods. Well, you know, government scientists love looking at 27 different ways of doing things. So, you know, that's a good thing. And Jerry Sanders at JSC, and there's some SBIRs out now that are starting to look in that area. But if we are seriously moving forward, and NASA's going to be in a quandary, we all know this for the next 2 or 3 years, and where we're going and how we're doing it, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the ISRU development world that could help in the next 2 or 3 years, help change what that decision will be. And what we're doing with Brad and I and some other folks in melting some meteorites and characterizing them so that we could use a magnetic rake on the moon or something like that, or different flow methods for oxygen reduction. Those are high leverage things that for low dollars, NASA could help the entire community enable, which may even have a feedback loop if there's discoveries that work in terrestrial mining. So there's some nice areas there. And also ground truth, RLEP, where you're going to land on the moon. If you're landing on the moon, obviously we want to go to the polar areas to figure out whether Wendell's right or whether Paul's right or whoever's right. And if we go there, the only way we're truly going to know is to put boots or robots on the ground to go and measure the soil. So let's answer that question, because that is such a key question and such a key enabler, and really that's NASA's role.
And the other thing is that these things that Dennis talks about, let's say ISRU, for example, or that NASA talks about, like building a lunar base. If you mine something on the Earth, or if you build a large facility on the Earth, where do you go? You don't go to NASA. You go to the construction, the design build industry. And in the late 80s, I had whipped them up to the point where I was sitting on the street in Albuquerque talking to the vice presidents of Brown and Root, Bechtel, Parsons, and one other about how that industry and the civil engineering industry could get involved in the Lunar Initiative. And they were excited because, you know, going to space for them is fantastic.
Remember the ASCE conferences?
Yeah, I know, the ASCE conferences. I was served on the ASCE for 5 years, went through the chairs to get in the aerospace division simply for the connectivity between that industry and space. And I told Aaron Cohen in his office when I said, you know, Aaron, I've come to realize that the space station should not be built by the aerospace industry, by Boeing and Lockheed. He looked at me and I said, it needs to be done by the Army Corps of Engineers and Bechtel. And he started laughing because he was no Army Corps of Engineers guy. He said, you might be right, but it's not going to happen. So, and I talked to the general, the Army Corps of Engineers. They were interested. The point is that space is an attractant. We live in it, so it's kind of our business. But there are people throughout the country who have what we call political influence and economic influence, and who could be drawn into this really easily because what we do is exciting.
Right. Real quick, what I'm going to do is 2 questions. If you can make it a question, not a speech. And we could, this gentleman right here, and we can get a microphone to him first. Whichever. Right. Yeah, great. Behind you.
Oh.
Okay.
I was just wondering, Bruce, could you comment just a little on Space Portal's concept for a lunar research park and the vision that you folks and the NASA research park have for moving this forward?
Yeah, what we were looking at was, and I have to attribute this to Lynn Harper, what we were looking at was, okay, what could be a long-term unifying thing? Going back to what Rick and everybody else has said, you can't, you know, a mission is not a goal. So one of the things that we were looking at are what could be a longer-term kind of a goal for going back to the moon. And so this idea of a research park that would enable a large number of things, and associated with that research park would be a university. So this idea of a combination, and this could be an international kind of a thing, but as a unifying theme, we've been playing around with that and kicking around some ideas, and it looks fairly attractive, so we're kind of excited about it.
And if I could just,
Gentleman in the blue, please.
I was just going to say, if I could put in a plug along those lines, the state of Hawaii is working closely with the research park on this concept. We're going to be holding a conference this November in Hawaii called The Next Giant Leap, Building Sustainable Settlements Beyond Low Earth Orbit. And our primary focus on this will be to support the Lunar Research Park concept.
Great, thank you. This gentleman here in the blue, and then we'll go to Al up here.
So good morning. My name is Rob Mueller. I'm with NASA. I lead the Surface Systems Office at Kennedy Space Center. And it's encouraging to me to hear all this talk this morning. But I want to make you all aware that there's a component of NewSpace that's missing here, which is the miners. I deal every day with the miners. We have some very good partnership with civil engineering companies and mining companies. They're very interested in working with us. We have many contracts in place today working with them. It's been a great success story, and I think this is something that NASA should publicize more, is the miners are interested. They're out there building machines. We're actively engaged in field tests at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, and we're actively doing ISRU. We are doing technology demonstrations. We're raising the TRL level to 6, and then we'll hand it off to commercial industry after TRL 6. But there are opportunities out there, and just want to make the community aware that this is happening already today.
In 1992, I got the because I'm from the United Mine Workers Union, I grew up in the coal mining area. I got the UMWA national organization to agree to allow us to modify the UMWA patch to put an astronaut in the patch. They loved it. NASA wouldn't hear of it at the time. I think the attitude's changed a little bit today.
Real quick, Al, toss one out. We'll deal
Just
with
a
it,
really
we'll
quick
wrap it
point.
up.
Can you quantify the difference in radiation between, like, say, L1 or the moon and low Earth orbit? I mean, what price do we pay in radiation for going outside the Van Allen belts?
Jim had it on his slide. He had these RP numbers, and I wish I could quote exactly what he had on his slides. But basically,
just mass.
no. He talked about the radiation dosage, and when you're in the Lagrange point, you're getting full dose. Oh, excuse me. When you're in the Lagrange point, radiation dose. When you're in the Lagrange point, you're getting the full dose of free space. The moon shields you from 2 pi because it blocks 2 pi of the galactic cosmic ray flux, for example, and the solar wind flux. But then there are some neutrons that come up from the surface of the moon. It might be a little troublesome. And then, what was the other place you asked me? Leo is within the Earth's magnetic field, and so Jim's it was RP2 in Leo and RP 500 in free space, I forget. But the Lagrange point is the same problem as going to Mars, basically, because you're outside the Earth's magnetic field, you're getting the full, you don't get any significant shielding of the galactic cosmic ray by solid flux, and you got the full solar wind.
Yeah, and it's actually going to be worse in a way over the next 2 or 3 decades because we're going into a much lower series of solar cycles than has been the case in the earlier part of the space age. So the galactic cosmic rays are actually going to be worse over at least the next 20, 30 years.
So I guess, moving into like the LEAG conference and such, a message to the lunar community is, you have 2 ways of looking at things. We can bitch and moan about what's been taken away, or we can start looking at what we can do with what we have and how we can leverage that into something that's exciting and new ways of looking at things, ways that can leverage. Profit doesn't necessarily have to be financial. It could be cultural, it could be scientific, et cetera. And I think there's ways for our government, private sector, scientists, mining companies, et cetera, all to be able to work together on looking at new ways of getting things done. One thing I personally would love to see in the near term is a completely self-supporting habitat living off of ISRU in the middle of the Mojave. Because if we can get it right there, because we haven't even done that on the Earth yet. So I want to see that happen. Where they're actually taking the desert sand and getting the water out of that and living off of that. Anyway, folks, I want to thank you for a great session. I want to thank our esteemed speakers who've done a great job. Feel free to accost them in the hall because they have a lot to say. I know they do. So thank you very much.